The secretary walked into the millionaire boss's office to deliver a document. She froze when she saw a photo of her mother in a black frame. Sophie Ellis clutched the wrinkled piece of paper in her trembling hands, the hastily scribbled address barely legible in her sweaty palm. 28 years old and still living paycheck to paycheck. If you could even call her sporadic income from temp jobs a paycheck. She pressed her back against the cold marble wall of the Lancaster Global Holdings building, watching streams of polished professionals flow through the revolving doors like water around a stone. This is it, she thought, smoothing down her only decent blazer, a thrift store find that she'd altered herself after watching her mother. Elena, work magic with needle and thread for years. This could change everything. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, about to interview for an executive assistant position at one of New York's most powerful companies, while her mother sat hunched over her ancient Singer sewing machine, squinting through reading glasses held together with electrical tape, hemming pants for $3 apiece. Sophie had watched Elena's hands become more gnarled each year, watched her mother's shoulders curve forward from decades of bending over fabric. Watch the light in her dark, honey-colored eyes dim a little more with each rejected job application Sophie brought home. Elena never complained. Not once. But Sophie saw the worry lines deepen around her eyes every time the rent notice came. Every time they had to choose between groceries and electricity. "Mija," Elena had whispered that morning, pressing a small cross into Sophie's palm. "This job, it's different. I can feel it." There had been something strange in her mother's voice. A tremor that Sophie couldn't quite place. Fear, hope. She couldn't tell. Now, standing in the shadow of the 60-story glass tower that housed Lancaster Global Holdings, Sophie understood why people called it the Crystal Palace. Everything gleamed. The marble floors, the chrome fixtures, even the security guard's buttons seemed to catch the light just right. It was a world away from their cramped queen's apartment where the radiator clanged all night, and the neighbor's baby cried through paper-thin walls. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt eternal. Sophie watched the numbers climb, each ding marking another floor between her old life and whatever waited above. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a young woman trying desperately to look confident. Chin up, shoulders back, the way Elena had taught her. Stand like you belong, Mija, even when you don't feel like you do. The executive floor was a study in understated power. Thick carpeting muffled every footstep, and original artwork lined the walls. Not the generic office prints she was used to, but real paintings that probably cost more than she and Elena made in a year. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Mrs. Harrison, the head of HR, was exactly what Sophie had expected. Silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, pearls at her throat, and a smile that managed to be both welcoming and measuring. "Miss Ellis, wonderful to meet you. Mr. Lancaster is just finishing a call. Would you mind delivering these contracts to his office? Consider it part of the interview. We need someone who can navigate the building confidently." Sophie's hands were steady as she took the leather portfolio, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Jonathan Lancaster. She'd Googled him, of course. 52 years old, inherited the company at 30. Known for his ruthless business acumen and his mysterious personal life. The tabloids called him Manhattan's most eligible widower, though he'd been divorced for over 20 years. They said he never smiled, never dated publicly, and had turned down more merger offers than any CEO in the city's history. The corner office door was slightly ajar, and Sophie could hear the low rumble of his voice. Professional, clipped, definitely not happy with whoever was on the other end of the call. She knocked softly. "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped into what felt like another world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, and the office itself was decorated with the kind of tasteful luxury that whispered rather than shouted wealth. But none of that registered for more than a split second. Her eyes found the painting immediately. It hung on the wall behind an enormous mahogany desk, set in an ornate black frame with gold details that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. But it wasn't the frame that made Sophie's breath catch in her throat. It was the woman in the painting. The subject was young, maybe 22, with glossy black hair falling in waves over one shoulder. She wore a deep blue dress that Sophie had never seen before. But the face, God, the face was impossible to mistake. It was her mother, not the tired, worn woman who fell asleep every night with her hands still smelling of fabric softener and industrial thread, but Elena as she must have been decades ago. Elena with bright, hopeful eyes and skin that glowed with youth. Elena with a smile that could light up rooms. The portfolio slipped from Sophie's nerveless fingers, contracts scattering across the Persian rug like fallen leaves. "I'm sorry, She dropped to her knees, frantically gathering papers with shaking hands. This was it. She'd blown her one chance, made a fool of herself in front of the most powerful man in the building. Elena would be so disappointed. Leave them. The voice was closer now, and Sophie looked up to find Jonathan Lancaster crouched beside her, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her stomach flip. Up close, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and heavy responsibilities. He was handsome in that understated way that money and good breeding produced. But there was something else, a sadness that seemed to live in the spaces between his words. "The painting," he said quietly. Not really a question. Sophie nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched his gaze flick between her face and the portrait, saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or confusion. "Who painted it?" she managed to whisper. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, "I did, a very long time ago." His voice carried the weight of old grief, old regrets. The woman in the painting. Her name was Elena. Elena Navarro. Sophie's world tilted sideways. Navarro, her mother's maiden name. The name Elena had whispered sometimes in her sleep. The name she'd never explained, no matter how many times Sophie asked. "That's my mother," Sophie breathed. Jonathan Lancaster went very still. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "That's impossible. Elena disappeared 29 years ago. She was..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "She was pregnant." The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they could cross. Sophie stared at the painting, at her mother's young, radiant face, and felt the ground beneath her feet shift in ways she didn't understand. Finally, Jonathan stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned back to face her, his expression was carefully controlled, but Sophie caught a glimpse of something raw and desperate in his eyes. "What's your last name?" he asked. "Ellis," Sophie said. "Sophie Ellis." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "How old are you, Sophie?" 28. Another nod. The math was simple enough. 29 years since Elena disappeared. 28 years since Sophie was born. But the implications... "I think," Jonathan said carefully, "you and I need to have a very long conversation." The conversation with Jonathan Lancaster never happened. Sophie had barely managed to stammer out an excuse about needing to get back to her interview before fleeing his office. Leaving the scattered contracts and her composure behind, Mrs. Harrison had taken one look at her pale face and rescheduled for the following week, citing technical difficulties. Now, 3 hours later, Sophie sat across from her mother in their tiny kitchen, watching Elena's weathered hands tremble as she poured tea into chipped mugs. The silence between them felt heavier than the humid Queen's air seeping through their ancient window unit. "Mommy," Sophie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to tell me about the Lancasters." Elena's cup shattered against the linoleum floor. 29 years earlier, summer 1995, the Lancaster estate in the Hamptons sprawled across 15 manicured acres, all rolling lawns and imported rose gardens that required a small army of groundskeepers to maintain. Elena Navarro had been working there for 6 months, one of 12 seamstresses employed to maintain the family's extensive wardrobe and the endless stream of custom linens required for their legendary dinner parties. At 22, Elena possessed the kind of natural beauty that made people turn their heads on the street. Dark hair that caught sunlight like silk, warm, honey-colored eyes, and a smile that could melt the coldest hearts. But it was her hands that had gotten her the job. Tiny, precise, capable of the most delicate embroidery work that Beatrice Lancaster demanded for her imported French tablecloths. Elena kept her head down and her mouth shut, the way her mother had taught her. Rich people's houses had their own rules, their own invisible boundaries that girls like her ignored at their peril. She worked in the converted carriage house with the other seamstresses, arrived at dawn, left at dusk, and tried not to think about how her weekly salary at the Lancaster house was more than her father made in a month at the auto shop. She might have kept that routine forever if not for the morning she discovered the art studio. Elena had been looking for Mrs. Lancaster to approve a repair on an antique quilt when she'd pushed open the wrong door and found herself in a sun-drenched room that smelled of turpentine and possibility. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, some half-completed, all of them capturing moments of light and shadow with a skill that made her breath catch. And there, standing before an easel with paint-stained fingers and concentration etched into every line of his face, was Jonathan Lancaster. At 23, he was nothing like the buttoned-up air she'd glimpsed from a distance. His dark hair was mussed, his white shirt rolled up to the elbows and splattered with blue paint. He moved with the focused intensity of someone completely absorbed in his work. And when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, his smile was like sunrise. "You're the new seamstress," he said, setting down his brush. "Elena, right?" She nodded, suddenly aware of her plain work dress and practical shoes. "I'm sorry." "Sir, I was looking for Mrs. Lancaster and Jonathan," he interrupted gently. "Just Jonathan, and don't apologize for appreciating art." He gestured to the canvas he'd been working on, a seascape that seemed to breathe with life. "What do you think?" Elena had never been asked her opinion about anything in this house. She studied the painting carefully, noting how he'd captured the exact color of ocean foam, the way afternoon light played across the waves. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "but sad somehow, like the ocean is remembering something it lost." Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his dark eyes. "That's exactly what I was trying to capture. How did you know?" Their first conversation lasted 2 hours. Elena forgot about finding Mrs. Lancaster, forgot about the work waiting for her, forgot about every rule she'd learned about staying invisible in rich people's houses. Jonathan showed her his paintings, landscapes, portraits, abstract pieces that seemed to contain entire worlds of emotion, and listened with genuine interest as she talked about the embroidery patterns passed down through generations of women in her family. "Art is art," he said when she tried to downplay her work. "Whether it's on canvas or cloth, whether it hangs in a museum or covers a table, beauty is beauty." That evening, Elena walked back to the carriage house with something bright and dangerous blooming in her chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. "Present day, you worked for them," Sophie said, watching her mother's face crumble. "The Lancasters. You worked for them, and something happened." Elena sank into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. For a moment, she looked every one of her 49 years, tired, worn down by decades of struggle and secrets that had eaten away at her from the inside. "Mija," she whispered, "there are things I never wanted you to know. Tell me." Sophie's voice was stronger now, fueled by the memory of Jonathan Lancaster's gray eyes and the recognition she'd seen there. "Tell me about my father." Elena's sob was barely human. "I loved him," she choked out. "Dios mío, how I loved him." Fall 1995. Their love affair unfolded in stolen moments and secret glances. Jonathan would find excuses to visit the carriage house, asking Elena to mend shirts that didn't need mending, to embroider handkerchiefs that would never be used. Elena would linger after the other seamstresses left, pretending to work late while Jonathan painted her portrait in the fading daylight. They were careful, achingly, desperately careful. Jonathan knew what his mother would say about his fascination with the help. Elena understood that her job, her family's stability, depended on maintaining the illusion of propriety. But love, as they discovered, had its own momentum. The first time he kissed her, they were in the rose garden at twilight. Elena had been walking back from the main house when she'd found Jonathan sitting on a stone bench, staring at nothing with the kind of hollow expression that made her heart ache. "Bad day?" she'd asked softly. He'd looked up at her, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. Every day is bad when you're living someone else's life. Elena had understood. She'd watched him at family gatherings, seen how he performed the role of dutiful heir while his eyes remained distant and sad. She'd heard Beatrice Lancaster discussing his future as if he were a stock portfolio to be managed rather than a person with dreams of his own. "What would you do?" Elena had asked, settling beside him on the bench. If you could live any life you wanted, paint, he'd said immediately. Travel. Find a small house somewhere with good light and paint until my fingers fell off. He'd turned to her then, his voice dropping to a whisper. What about you? I'd learned to read, Elena had admitted, the confession feeling like a confession of love. Really read, not just the little bit I picked up in school. I'd read everything. Poetry, novels, stories about places I'll never see. I could teach you, Jonathan had said, and the offer had hung between them like a bridge. That night, he'd taught her to read his name by tracing the letters in the dirt with a stick, and when she'd traced them back perfectly, he'd kissed her, as if she'd just recited Shakespeare. By winter, they were meeting every evening. By spring, Elena was 3 months pregnant, and they were planning a secret wedding. They might have succeeded if not for Beatrice Lancaster's talent for destruction. Present day, he wanted to marry me, Elena whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. We were going to elope, start fresh somewhere else. He was going to give up everything for me. For us. Sophie felt something crack inside her chest. What happened? Elena's eyes went distant, lost in a memory that still had the power to destroy her. His mother found out. She made me believe terrible things, showed me papers, medical reports that said I was sick, that I would hurt the baby, hurt Jonathan. She said, if I really loved him, I would disappear. And you believed her. I was 22 and terrified, Elena said simply. I didn't know about lawyers or second opinions or fighting back. I just knew that everyone was telling me I was poison, and that staying would destroy everything I loved. Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 28 years of deception settling on her shoulders. So you ran? I took the money she offered and disappeared, changed my name to Ellis, moved to North Carolina, then here when you were 5, I never... Elena's voice broke completely. I never told him about you. He doesn't know you exist. But Sophie thought about the recognition in Jonathan Lancaster's eyes, about the way he'd studied her face as if memorizing it. She thought about a man who'd kept his ex-lover's portrait in his office for nearly 3 decades, and she wasn't so sure. Mommy, she said quietly, I think he's starting to figure it out. Spring 1995. Beatrice Lancaster had built her life on control. At 49, she ruled Manhattan's social elite with the precision of a military strategist and the ruthlessness of a corporate raider. Her dinner parties were legendary, her charity galas raised millions, and her approval could make or break careers in New York's most exclusive circles. But watching her son, her only child, her carefully groomed heir, moon over a seamstress like some lovesick teenager threatened to unravel everything she'd spent decades constructing. Beatrice stood at her bedroom window, watching Jonathan and Elena walk hand in hand through the rose garden, their heads bent together in intimate conversation. Even from this distance, she could see the way her son's entire bearing had changed over the past months. Gone was the dutiful, if distant, young man she'd raised. In his place stood someone she barely recognized, someone whose eyes lit up when that girl entered a room, someone who smiled like he'd discovered fire. It made her sick, not because Elena wasn't beautiful. Beatrice wasn't blind. The girl was stunning in that natural, effortless way that couldn't be bought or taught, not even because she was poor. Beatrice had grown up with money, but she understood that fortune could be made. No, what terrified Beatrice was simpler and more primitive than class consciousness. Elena made Jonathan happy in a way that threatened every plan Beatrice had ever made for the Lancaster legacy. Happy men made impulsive decisions. Happy men threw away empires for love. And Beatrice would be damned if she'd let some nobody from Queens destroy what 3 generations of Lancasters had built. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd hoped never to use. Dr. Morrison, it's Beatrice Lancaster. I need a favor. 2 weeks later, Elena sat in the sterile examination room, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The medical office in downtown Manhattan was nothing like the community clinic where she usually went. All marble surfaces and expensive equipment that hummed with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Lancaster had insisted on the appointment after Elena's morning sickness had become too obvious to hide. The best doctors for my future daughter-in-law, Beatrice had said with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. We want to make sure everything is perfect for the baby. Future daughter-in-law. The word still made Elena's heart skip, even as something cold writhed in her stomach. Jonathan had been overjoyed when she'd finally worked up the courage to tell him about the pregnancy, spinning her around the art studio until they were both dizzy with laughter and possibilities. "We'll elope next week," he'd whispered against her hair. "Before anyone can stop us, before my mother can object." But Beatrice hadn't objected. She'd been surprisingly gracious, even warm, when Jonathan had finally confessed their relationship and Elena's condition. She'd insisted on the best prenatal care. The finest doctors had even started discussing wedding plans with an enthusiasm that had left Elena cautiously hopeful. Maybe she'd misjudged the woman. Maybe love really could bridge any gap. Dr. Morrison entered the room with a grave expression that made Elena's newly optimistic world tilt sideways. He was older, distinguished, with the kind of bearing that radiated authority and made questioning him feel like blasphemy. "Miss Navarro," he said, settling behind his desk with a file that seemed too thick for a routine prenatal visit. "I'm afraid we need to discuss some concerns about your test results." Elena's mouth went dry. "Concerns? The blood work we ran shows some troubling indicators. You have what appears to be a sexually transmitted infection. Syphilis, to be specific, left untreated. It can cause severe birth defects, stillbirth, or death of the infant." The world seemed to narrow to a single point of agonizing clarity. Elena stared at the doctor, certain she'd misheard. "That's impossible. Jonathan is the only person I've ever been with, and he's clean. He had to be tested for the family's insurance policy last year." Dr. Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but Elena caught something else there. Pity, maybe, or disgust. "These things can lie dormant for years, and I'm afraid there's more." He opened the file, revealing charts and numbers that meant nothing to Elena, but looked damning in their clinical precision. "The infection appears to be quite advanced. Treatment during pregnancy carries significant risks to the fetus." Elena felt the room spinning around her. What kind of risks? Brain damage, blindness, skeletal deformities. Each word fell like a physical blow. "Miss Navarro, I need to be frank with you. Continuing this pregnancy while infected would be..." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "It would be irresponsible, cruel, even. There has to be treatment, antibiotics, something. Not during pregnancy. Not without substantial risk to the child." Dr. Morrison leaned forward, his voice taking on a paternal tone that somehow made everything worse. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but you're young. There will be other opportunities for children. When you're healthy and married to someone appropriate." Someone appropriate. The words hit Elena like a slap, and suddenly the clinical sympathy in the doctor's eyes looked like something else entirely. "Mrs. Lancaster arranged this appointment. Mrs. Lancaster is concerned about her son's future, and frankly, so am I." Dr. Morrison closed the file with a snap. "Mr. Lancaster has political aspirations. Miss Navarro, a scandal involving an illegitimate child with health problems could destroy his career before it begins." Elena stood on unsteady legs, the room tilting around her. "I need to talk to Jonathan. That would be inadvisable. In fact, I'd recommend against any contact with the family until you've dealt with this situation." The doctor's tone had shifted from paternal to dismissive. "Mrs. Lancaster has authorized me to provide you with information about appropriate facilities, discreet ones." The pamphlets he handed her might as well have been death sentences, abortion clinics, all of them far from New York, all of them promising complete confidentiality and compassionate care. Elena stumbled out of the office and onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, where the spring sunshine felt like mockery against her skin. Around her, the city pulsed with life and possibility, while her own world crumbled into ash. Present day, Sophie stared at her mother, horror and understanding warring in her chest. She lied. "The whole thing was a setup." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't know that then. I was young and scared and alone. When a doctor tells you that your baby will be born blind and brain damaged because of something in your blood." She shrugged helplessly. "I believed him. What did you do?" "I panicked. I couldn't think straight for days. The pamphlet sat on my dresser like accusations, and every time I looked at them I felt sicker. Finally, I decided I had to tell Jonathan everything, whatever happened. We'd face it together." Sophie felt a spark of hope. "You told him." Elena's face crumpled. I tried, but when I went to the main house, Mrs. Lancaster was waiting for me. She said Jonathan had asked her to speak to me, that he'd learned about my condition and needed time to think. Spring 1995. Continued. He's very young, Beatrice had said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. And he has such a bright future ahead of him. You understand how difficult this must be for him. Elena had felt something vital break inside her chest. He doesn't want to see me. He's concerned. Naturally. About the baby. About your health. About what this means for both of your futures. Beatrice had gestured to a chair as if they were having tea instead of destroying lives. I've taken the liberty of making some arrangements. There's a clinic in North Carolina that specializes in these situations. Very discreet. Very professional. I don't want an abortion. Of course not. Who would? Beatrice's smile had been sharp as a blade. But sometimes we have to make difficult choices for the greater good, for the people we love. Elena had stared at the woman who would have been her mother-in-law, searching for some hint of compassion or understanding. Instead, she'd found only cold calculation. If you truly love my son, Beatrice had continued, you'll spare him the agony of watching you destroy an innocent child out of selfishness. And if you care about your own family's welfare, you'll consider how generous the Lancaster family can be to those who make the right choices. The check Beatrice had slid across the table had more zeros than Elena had ever seen in one place. Enough to pay off her parents' mortgage, to send her younger brothers to college, to change her family's entire trajectory. Of course, Beatrice had added with casual cruelty, if you choose to stay and burden Jonathan with a sick child, I'm sure my son will do his duty. He's been raised to be responsible after all. But imagine what that would do to him. Watching his political career die before it starts. Watching his child suffer because of your disease, he'd never say it. But in his heart, he'd blame you. Eventually, he'd come to hate you. Elena had taken the money and disappeared that very night. Present day. I wrote him a letter, Elena whispered. Before I left, I explained everything. About the baby, about what the doctor said, about why I had to go. I begged him not to look for me, told him I loved him too much to destroy his life. Sophie felt pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. Did you send it? I gave it to Mrs. Lancaster. She promised she'd deliver it after I was gone, when he'd had time to process everything. Elena's laugh was bitter as poison. I was so naive. I actually thought she cared about my feelings. What happened to the letter? Elena met her daughter's eyes, and Sophie saw 29 years of regret staring back at her. I have no idea, but knowing what I know now about that woman, I'd bet my life that Jonathan never saw it. Sophie thought about the man she'd met that afternoon, the grief in his gray eyes when he'd spoken about Elena's disappearance, the way he'd painted her portrait and kept it in his office like a shrine to lost love, a man who'd been searching for answers for nearly 3 decades, never knowing that the woman he loved had been driven away by lies and manipulation. Mommy, she said quietly, I think it's time you knew something. Jonathan Lancaster has been looking for you for 29 years, and tomorrow, I'm going back to tell him exactly where you are. Sophie's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt outside Jonathan Lancaster's office door the next morning. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning with fragments of her mother's story and the weight of 29 years of deception. Elena had begged her not to come back, had spent half the night pacing their tiny apartment like a caged animal. Mija, you don't understand what these people are capable of, Elena had whispered, clutching Sophie's hands. Beatrice Lancaster destroyed my life once. She won't hesitate to destroy yours too. But Sophie had seen something in Jonathan's eyes yesterday, a raw vulnerability that had nothing to do with wealth or power. Whatever game his mother had played, he'd been a victim too. Now, standing outside his office with a manila folder containing copies of Elena's old employment records and the receipt from the clinic where she'd first learned about her pregnancy, Sophie wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Miss Ellis, Mrs. Harrison's voice made her jump. Mr. Lancaster is ready for you. Jonathan was standing by the window when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at Central Park. He looked older somehow, as if their brief encounter yesterday had aged him years in the span of a single night. You came back, he said without turning around. I promised I would. People break promises. His voice carried the weight of old disappointments, especially when it comes to the Lancaster family. Sophie set the folder on his desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. My mother kept her promises, even the ones that destroyed her. That got his attention. Jonathan turned slowly, his gray eyes fixing on her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. Up close, she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw that spoke of a sleepless night. "Tell me," he said simply. So Sophie did. She told him about Elena's terror when confronted with false medical reports, about Beatrice's manipulations and threats, about the letter her mother had written and trusted his mother to deliver. With each revelation, Jonathan's expression grew more distant, as if he were retreating somewhere deep inside himself, where the truth couldn't reach him. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "She was pregnant," Jonathan said finally, his voice barely audible. "All these years, I thought she'd left because she didn't love me," my mother said. He stopped, swallowed hard. "My mother showed me a letter, Elena's handwriting, saying she'd never cared about me, that she was leaving with someone else." "Forged," Sophie said quietly. "It had to be." Jonathan nodded slowly, as if the pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. 29 years. 29 years of thinking I wasn't worth staying for. He looked at Sophie, then really looked, taking in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth. "You have her smile, but your eyes, they're mine." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. "Mr. Lancaster." "Jonathan," he corrected. "If you're my daughter, you should call me Jonathan." If. The word carried the weight of possibility and terror in equal measure. Sophie had dreamed of finding her father her entire life, but not like this. Not wrapped in decades of lies and manipulation. Not with the specter of Beatrice Lancaster hovering over everything like a malevolent spirit. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Jonathan called. The young man who entered moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Tall and lean, with dark hair and startling blue eyes. He had the kind of effortless handsomeness that belonged on magazine covers. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his smile easy and charming. "Dad, Mrs. Harrison said you wanted to..." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Sophie, his expression shifting from casual familiarity to curious interest. "Sorry, I didn't realize you had a meeting." "Daniel," Jonathan said, and Sophie caught something strained in his voice. "This is Sophie Ellis, our new executive assistant, Sophie. My son Daniel." Daniel's smile widened as he crossed the room, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Sophie, beautiful name for a beautiful woman." His handshake lingered just a moment too long, his eyes moving over her face with obvious appreciation. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in showing me around the city sometime. I know all the best restaurants." Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks, acutely aware of Jonathan's sharp gaze fixed on both of them. "That's very kind, but she'll be quite busy getting adjusted to her new position," Jonathan interrupted smoothly. "Perhaps you should focus on your own responsibilities, Daniel." Daniel's grin didn't waver, but Sophie caught a flash of something else in his eyes. Rebellion, maybe, or simple stubbornness. "Of course, Dad, but all work and no play." He turned back to Sophie with renewed interest. "What do you say we grab coffee later, just to welcome you to the Lancaster family properly?" The words Lancaster family hit Sophie like a physical blow. If her suspicions were correct, if Jonathan really was her father, then Daniel was her half-brother. The handsome young man flirting with her so openly was her own blood. "I really should get back to work," she managed, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "Another time then?" Daniel said easily. "I'm very persistent when I see something I want." After he left, Sophie sank into the chair across from Jonathan's desk, her legs suddenly unsteady. The implications of what she'd just witnessed made her stomach churn. "He doesn't know," she said. "No one knows, not yet." Jonathan was studying her again with that unsettling intensity. "Sophie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She nodded, though part of her wanted to run from whatever question was coming. "Why now? Why come here? To this company? For this job? After 29 years? What brought you into my life?" Sophie thought about Elena's face when she'd seen the job posting, about the strange mixture of fear and longing in her mother's voice. "I needed work. The temp agency sent me here." She paused, then added, "But I think maybe my mother knew. Deep down, I think she knew this would happen eventually. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk in a rhythm that reminded Sophie of her own nervous habits. "There's a way to be certain," he said finally. "DNA testing." "But Sophie," he leaned forward, his expression grave. "If we're right about this, if you are my daughter, it changes everything. Not just for us, but for Daniel, for the company, for the family trust. Are you prepared for that?" Sophie thought about Elena working 16-hour days to keep food on the table, about the stack of unpaid bills on their kitchen counter, about all the nights she'd fallen asleep wondering who her father was and why he'd never tried to find her. "I've been prepared my entire life," she said quietly. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Then we'll know for certain by tomorrow evening." He reached for his phone, then paused. "Sophie, there's something else you need to understand, my mother. Beatrice. She's not the woman she was 29 years ago, but she's still dangerous. If she discovers what we suspect, if she realizes you're Elena's daughter, what will she do?" Jonathan's smile was grim. "Whatever it takes to protect what she sees as hers. The family name, the company, Daniel's inheritance." He met her eyes directly. "She destroyed your mother's life to keep me in line. She won't hesitate to destroy yours to keep Daniel from any complications she deems inappropriate." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean she'd try to keep us apart, Daniel and me? Among other things." Jonathan's expression darkened. "Beatrice has very specific ideas about bloodlines and family purity. The idea that her grandson might be attracted to his own half-sister." He shook his head. "She'd see it as the ultimate corruption of everything she's tried to build." The irony wasn't lost on Sophie. 29 years ago, Beatrice had driven Elena away to prevent her son from marrying beneath his station. Now, if fate had its way, history might repeat itself with a twist that would make even a soap opera writer blush. "What do we do?" Sophie asked. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, staring at the portrait of Elena that dominated the wall behind his desk. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of regret and determination. "We find the truth, all of it, and then we decide whether the Lancaster family legacy is worth preserving, or if it's time to burn it all down and start over." Outside the office windows, storm clouds were gathering over Manhattan, casting shadows across the city that seemed to echo the darkness Sophie felt settling over her life. She'd come here looking for a job and financial stability. Instead, she'd stumbled into a family drama that threatened to destroy everyone involved. But as she looked at Jonathan, this man who might be her father, who'd spent 3 decades mourning a love stolen from him by lies, Sophie realized she was already too deep to turn back. The truth, whatever it was, would set them all free, or destroy them completely. The DNA results would take 48 hours. Jonathan had insisted on using a private lab, one that catered to Manhattan's elite and guaranteed absolute discretion. "My mother has contacts everywhere," he'd explained grimly. "We can't risk word getting back to her before we're ready." Those 48 hours stretched before Sophie like an eternity. She'd called in sick to her temp job, no point in maintaining that fiction now, and spent the first day pacing her mother's apartment like a caged animal. Elena had retreated into herself, speaking in monosyllables and jumping at every sound from the hallway. By the second morning, Sophie couldn't stand it anymore. She needed answers, needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. If Beatrice Lancaster had orchestrated Elena's disappearance with such calculated cruelty, what else had she done over the years? What other lives had she destroyed to maintain her vision of family purity? The New York Public Library's archives were a revelation. Sophie had never been much of a researcher, but desperation made her resourceful. She started with newspaper clippings from the summer of 1995, looking for any mention of the Lancaster family around the time Elena had fled. What she found made her blood run cold. Lancaster heir hospitalized following breakdown, July 15th, 1995. The promising young artist Jonathan Lancaster, 23, was admitted to Mount Sinai Hospital yesterday following what sources describe as a severe emotional collapse. Lancaster, heir to the Lancaster Global Holdings fortune, had been expected to announce his engagement to socialite Lauren Wexler at the family's annual summer gala. Instead, witnesses report he became increasingly agitated throughout the evening, finally collapsing during his mother's welcome speech. Mrs. Beatrice Lancaster released a statement citing exhaustion and stress from his recent graduation from Columbia. Sophie's hand shook as she read further. The breakdown had happened exactly 2 weeks after Elena's disappearance. She found more articles scattered through the summer and fall of 1995. Jonathan's extended recovery period, his eventual engagement to Lauren Wexler in December, their quick marriage in February 1996. The timeline was damning. Beatrice had driven Elena away in July, watched her son suffer a psychological breakdown, then maneuvered him into a rebound marriage within 8 months. It wasn't just manipulation. It was systematic destruction and reconstruction of her son's life. Sophie's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Coffee, Daniel Lancaster. Got your number from HR. Promise I don't bite. She stared at the message, her stomach churning. Daniel had been texting her constantly since their meeting, each message more flirtatious than the last. If her suspicions were correct, her half-brother was actively pursuing her, completely unaware of the biological impossibility of their attraction. Working today? Sorry, she texted back, then immediately felt guilty. None of this was Daniel's fault. He was as much a victim of family secrets as anyone else. Her phone rang almost immediately. Daniel's voice was warm and persuasive. Come on, Sophie. All work and no play makes beautiful women very dull. Besides, I have something I want to show you. Daniel, I really can't. The family estate in the Hamptons. It's gorgeous this time of year, and I thought you might like to see where your new boss grew up. Very romantic, very private. His voice dropped to what he clearly thought was a seductive whisper. Just the two of us. Sophie closed her eyes, fighting a wave of nausea. That's not appropriate. Why? Because you work for my father, Sophie. You're an executive assistant, not a nun. Besides, his tone shifted, becoming more serious. I get the feeling you're carrying some heavy stuff around. Maybe talking to someone would help. The genuine concern in his voice made everything worse. Daniel wasn't just some spoiled rich boy. He was kind, thoughtful, completely sincere in his interest, under any other circumstances. Sophie might have been flattered by his attention. I appreciate the offer, but is it because of my dad? Sophie's breath caught. What do you mean? Come on. I've seen how he looks at you, like he's seen a ghost or something. And yesterday in his office, there was this weird tension. Daniel paused. Look, I know my father can be intense, but don't let him scare you off. He's been through a lot, especially with women. There was someone years ago who really messed him up. He's never gotten over it. Someone. Sophie's voice sounded strange in her own ears. Some girl he was obsessed with in college. Before my mom. Dad never talks about it, but grandmother used to mention her sometimes. Always with this disgusted look, like she was discussing something that crawled out of a sewer. Said the girl was a gold digger who tried to trap Dad with a pregnancy scare, then disappeared when she realized the family wouldn't be fooled. Sophie felt the world tilt sideways. Even now, nearly 30 years later, Beatrice was still poisoning the well, still spreading lies about Elena to justify her actions. What happened to her? Sophie managed to ask. No idea. Probably married some other rich guy and lived happily ever after. But it really screwed Dad up. He married Mom on the rebound, had me, then spent the next 20 years being the most emotionally unavailable man on the planet. Daniel's voice softened. That's why I was hoping. Maybe someone new in his life might help him move on. You seem different, Sophie. Real. And I've never seen him react to anyone the way he reacted to you. The irony was suffocating. Daniel was essentially asking Sophie to heal his father's broken heart, never knowing that she was the living proof of that lost love, the daughter of the woman who'd disappeared all those years ago. Daniel, she said carefully, what if I told you there were things about your family that you didn't know? Important things. Like what? His tone was curious rather than alarmed. More skeletons in the Lancaster closet, Sophie. My family's been in the society pages for 3 generations. Trust me, whatever secrets you think we're hiding, I've probably already heard worse. Sophie doubted that. What about your grandmother? What's she like? Daniel's laugh had an edge to it. Grandmother Beatrice, she's formidable, brilliant, ruthless, absolutely devoted to the family legacy. She basically ran Dad's life until he finally stood up to her about 10 years ago. Even now, she still thinks she knows what's best for everyone. Has she ever mentioned wanting to meet me? Actually, yeah. She's been asking about Dad's new assistant ever since you started. Wants to have you over for dinner next week, which is weird because Grandmother usually doesn't bother with the help. No offense, he added quickly. Sophie felt ice form in the pit of her stomach. Beatrice wanted to meet her. The woman who destroyed Elena's life had somehow gotten wind of Sophie's existence and was already moving to neutralize whatever threat she represented. Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Shoot. If you found out that everything you believed about your family was a lie, that people you trusted had done terrible things, what would you do? There was a long pause. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had lost its playful edge. Sophie, what's really going on here? You're starting to scare me. Before Sophie could answer, her phone buzzed with another call. Jonathan's name flashed on the screen. I have to go, she told Daniel. But Daniel, be careful who you trust, even family. She hung up and answered Jonathan's call, her heart pounding. The results are in, Jonathan said without preamble. Can you meet me at my apartment? There are things we need to discuss before. He paused. Before we decide what to do next. Sophie grabbed her jacket, her mind racing. In a few minutes, she would know for certain whether Jonathan Lancaster was her father, whether Daniel was her half-brother, whether Elena's 29 years of sacrifice had been based on lies that were still destroying lives. As she headed for the subway, Sophie's phone buzzed one more time. A text from Daniel. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone. I'm here if you need me. Sophie stared at the message, her heart breaking for this young man who had no idea that his kindness was making everything infinitely more complicated. Soon, very soon, she would have to find a way to tell him that the woman he was falling for was his sister, and then she would have to figure out how to protect him from the truth that was about to destroy them all. Jonathan's penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building overlooking Central Park. Sophie had expected opulence. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, the kind of aggressive wealth display that screamed old money. Instead, she found herself in what felt like an artist's sanctuary. Natural light flooded through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating canvases that lined the walls, some finished, others half-completed, all of them capturing moments of profound emotion. The furniture was comfortable rather than showy, books scattered on every surface, paint-stained easels positioned to catch the afternoon sun. It's beautiful, Sophie said, genuinely surprised. Jonathan stood by the window, his back to her, a sealed envelope in his hands. This was supposed to be temporary. After my divorce, I moved in here to be closer to the office. That was 22 years ago. He turned, and Sophie saw her own nervous energy reflected in his gray eyes. I kept meaning to find something more suitable, more expected, but this place has good light for painting. Sophie's gaze drifted to a canvas on the nearest easel, a work in progress, showing Central Park in autumn. The trees ablaze with color. You still paint when I can't sleep, which is most nights. Jonathan held up the envelope like it contained either salvation or damnation. Are you ready for this? Sophie nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. 28 years of wondering, of constructing elaborate fantasies about her father, all came down to whatever was written on the paper inside that envelope. Jonathan opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the technical language and percentages. His face went completely white. Jonathan, Sophie's voice sounded far away in her own ears. He looked up at her, and in that moment, Sophie saw her own eyes staring back at her. The same shape, the same storm gray color that she'd inherited despite Elena's warm brown ones. 99.7% probability, he said quietly. You're my daughter. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither quite knew how to cross. Sophie had prepared for this moment, had imagined it 1,000 different ways, but the reality was somehow both smaller and more overwhelming than anything she'd envisioned. So what happens now? She asked. Jonathan set the papers aside and sank into an armchair that had clearly seen years of use. Now we figure out how to tell Daniel that the woman he's been pursuing is his sister. Now we decide whether to confront my mother with her crimes. Now we try to find a way to rebuild what she destroyed without destroying everything else in the process. Sophie thought about Daniel's texts, about the genuine warmth in his voice, about the impossible situation they were all trapped in. He doesn't know about any of this, about Elena, about me. About what your mother did. Daniel thinks his grandmother is difficult but essentially well-meaning. He has no idea she's capable of the kind of systematic manipulation she inflicted on your mother. Jonathan's voice turned bitter. Hell, until yesterday I didn't know either. I thought she was controlling and status-obsessed, but not evil. What are you going to tell him? The truth, all of it. Jonathan stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a thick file folder. But first, there's something else you need to see. After our conversation yesterday, I hired a private investigator to dig into what my mother did in 1995. What he found. Jonathan's jaw tightened. It's worse than we thought. Sophie opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photocopied documents, bank records, and what looked like correspondence between Beatrice Lancaster and various medical professionals. She didn't just pay off Dr. Morrison, Jonathan explained. She created an entire network of fake medical records, forged test results, even hired actors to pose as specialists. The paper trail shows payments to at least 6 different people, all designed to convince your mother that she was infected with syphilis. Sophie stared at the evidence, feeling sick. This is insane. Why go to such elaborate lengths? Because she knew Elena. She knew your mother was intelligent, caring, that she wouldn't just accept one doctor's word if she thought her baby was at risk. So Beatrice made sure every avenue Elena might pursue would lead to the same devastating conclusion. Jonathan's voice was heavy with disgust. She studied your mother like a lab specimen, identified her weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. A bank record caught Sophie's eye. A payment made to something called Asheville Women's Clinic, 3 weeks after Elena's disappearance. What's this? Jonathan's expression grew even grimmer. My mother had Elena followed. She knew your mother was pregnant, knew she was planning to keep the baby despite everything, so she had people watching, waiting to see what Elena would do next. To what end? Insurance. If Elena had ever tried to come back, if she'd ever attempted to contact me or claim that I was the father of her child, Beatrice would have had proof that Elena had sought medical treatment for her condition, even after leaving New York. It would have supported the lie that Elena was diseased and irresponsible. Sophie felt the full weight of Beatrice's manipulations settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She thought of everything except the possibility that Elena might raise her child to be strong enough to find her way back here eventually. Jonathan looked at Sophie with something that might have been pride. She never anticipated you. The apartment's intercom buzzed, making them both jump. Jonathan frowned and pressed the button. Yes, Mr. Lancaster, it's Daniel. I know you're not expecting me, but I really need to talk to you. It's about Sophie. Sophie and Jonathan stared at each other in panic. Don't let him up, Sophie whispered. I'm not ready. Dad, are you there? Jonathan pressed the button again. Of course, son. Come up. Jonathan, no, Sophie hissed. We haven't figured out how to tell him yet. There's no good way to tell someone that the woman they're interested in is their sister, Jonathan said grimly. And delaying it will only make things worse. He looked at her with sympathy and determination. He's my son, Sophie. Our family has been built on lies for long enough. Sophie felt panic rising in her throat. What if he doesn't believe us? What if he thinks we're lying to keep him away from me? Then we'll show him the DNA results. We'll show him everything. Jonathan moved to the window, watching the street below. Sophie, Daniel is a good person. Yes, this will hurt him. Probably devastate him, but he deserves the truth. The elevator chimed in the hallway outside, followed by Daniel's familiar knock. Jonathan squeezed Sophie's shoulder gently. Whatever happens next, we face it together, as a family. Sophie nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to run. In a few moments, she would watch Daniel's world crumble the same way hers had 2 days ago. She would see the moment when his innocent attraction turned to horror and disgust. Come in, Jonathan called. Daniel entered with his usual confident stride, but Sophie could see tension in his shoulders, worry in his blue eyes. Dad, He stopped when he saw Sophie, his expression brightening automatically. Sophie, perfect timing. I was just telling Dad about this weird conversation we had earlier and… Daniel, Jonathan interrupted gently. Sit down, please. Something in his father's tone made Daniel's smile falter. He looked between Jonathan and Sophie, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation. Okay, Now you're both scaring me. What's going on? Jonathan picked up the DNA results from his desk, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Son, there's something about Sophie, about our family, that you need to know. Something that changes everything. Daniel sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving his father's face. Changes everything how? Sophie closed her eyes, bracing herself for the explosion that was about to destroy them all. Sophie is your sister, Jonathan said quietly. Your half-sister. She's my daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie opened her eyes to see Daniel staring at her with an expression of complete incomprehension, as if the words had been spoken in a foreign language. That's not possible, he said finally. Dad, that's not funny. Jonathan held out the DNA results. I wish it were a joke. Daniel took the papers with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the technical jargon and percentages. Sophie watched the exact moment when understanding hit him, saw his face go pale, saw his hands begin to tremble, saw something fundamental break behind his eyes. Oh God, he whispered. Oh my God, we almost... He looked at Sophie with a mixture of horror and heartbreak that made her want to disappear. I was falling in love with my own sister. Daniel sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. The DNA results clutched in his white-knuckled hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, unrecognizable. How long have you known? 2 days, Sophie said quietly. I found out about the connection when I saw your father's painting of my mother. Everything else. We've been piecing it together since then. Daniel's laugh was bitter, broken. 2 days? I've been texting you, calling you, making a complete fool of myself for 2 days while you knew we were... He couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel, Jonathan said gently. Sophie didn't know initially. None of us did. Your grandmother made sure of that. Grandmother. Daniel's head snapped up, confusion replacing the horror in his expression. What does she have to do with this? Jonathan and Sophie exchanged glances. They'd agreed to tell Daniel everything, but seeing him like this, shattered and vulnerable, made the prospect of adding more pain feel almost cruel. Son, Jonathan began carefully, what do you know about why I married your mother? Daniel frowned. You met at a charity function, love at first sight, according to the family story. Why? That's not exactly what happened. Jonathan moved to the window, unable to meet his son's eyes. I married Lauren because I was broken, because the woman I really loved had disappeared, and I thought she'd chosen someone else over me. Elena, Sophie said softly. Elena Navarro, your mother. Jonathan's voice carried 29 years of grief. We were going to elope. She was pregnant. We were planning our future together, and then one day she was just gone. My mother told me Elena had written a letter saying she'd never loved me, that she was leaving with another man. Daniel was staring at his father as if seeing him for the first time. But that wasn't true. No, your grandmother orchestrated the entire thing. She hired fake doctors to convince Elena that she had syphilis, that continuing the pregnancy would harm the baby. She forged medical records, created an elaborate lie to drive Elena away. Jonathan finally turned back to face his son. Elena left because she thought she was protecting me and the baby. She thought she was diseased. The color drained from Daniel's face completely. Grandmother did that. Our grandmother. We have proof, Sophie said, gesturing to the folder Jonathan had shown her. Bank records, correspondence, payments to people who participated in the deception. It's all there. Daniel stood abruptly and walked to the window, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. She's been planning to have you over for dinner, grandmother. She wants to meet you. He turned back to Sophie, his eyes wide with dawning horror. She knows, doesn't she? She knows who you are. Sophie felt ice form in her stomach. How could she know? The same way she knew everything else. Jonathan said grimly. Beatrice has contacts everywhere. At the company. In the government, probably at the DNA lab we used. She's made it her business to know everything that affects the Lancaster family for the past 50 years. Then she's already planning something, Daniel said, his voice gaining strength as understanding crystallized. Grandmother doesn't invite people to dinner without an agenda, especially not people she considers threats to the family. Jonathan was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling security. If she knows about Sophie, if she's planning another manipulation. No. The firmness in Sophie's voice surprised everyone, including herself. We can't keep running from her. We can't keep letting her control everyone's lives with lies and fear. Sophie, Jonathan said carefully, you don't understand what you're dealing with. My mother has spent decades perfecting the art of destroying people who threaten her vision of what the Lancaster family should be. She won't hesitate to what? Forge more medical records, hire more actors, create more elaborate lies. Sophie's voice was gaining heat. She's 78 years old and, according to Daniel, she's been asking to meet me. That means she's curious, maybe even worried. People who are completely confident in their power don't need to assess their enemies in person. Daniel was watching her with something like admiration. You want to meet with her? I want to confront her. All of us. Together. I want her to explain to your father's face why she thought destroying his happiness was worth protecting the family name. I want her to look at me and justify stealing 28 years of my life with my father. It's too dangerous, Jonathan protested. You don't know how manipulative she can be. She'll twist everything, make you doubt what you know to be true. That's what she does. Then we make sure she can't. Sophie's mind was racing, pieces of a plan falling into place. We bring proof. We bring witnesses. We bring her own words back to haunt her. What do you mean? Sophie turned to Daniel. You said she's been talking about the woman who trapped your father with a pregnancy scare. What if we could get her to tell that story again, with details? What if we could get her to explain exactly how she saved the family from Elena's supposed deception? You want to record her? Daniel said slowly. I want her to confess in her own words, with her own voice. I want proof that can't be denied or twisted or explained away. Sophie looked between Jonathan and Daniel. She destroyed my mother's life with lies. The least we can do is let her destroy her own legacy with the truth. Jonathan was shaking his head. Sophie, even if we could get her to confess, even if we had irrefutable proof of what she did, what then? She's dying. Daniel told us that cancer. What's the point of exposing her now? The point, Sophie said fiercely, is that Elena has spent 29 years believing she was diseased and dangerous. She's lived with guilt and shame and regret for nearly 3 decades because of your mother's lies. She deserves to know that none of it was her fault. And I deserve to know the truth about my own family, Daniel added quietly. Dad, I've spent my entire life hearing stories about the great Beatrice Lancaster, about her wisdom and strength and dedication to family legacy. If it's all been built on lies and manipulation, he swallowed hard. I need to know. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the painting of Elena that dominated one wall of his living room. The annual charity gala, he said finally. It's next week. Beatrice never misses it. It's her chance to hold court, to remind New York society why the Lancaster name matters. She'll be on stage, giving her traditional welcome speech. Perfect audience, Sophie said. Hard to deny a confession made in front of 500 of Manhattan's elite. You're talking about destroying her publicly, humiliating her in front of everyone who matters to her. Jonathan's voice carried a note of warning. She won't go down quietly. If we do this, if we expose her like that, there's no going back. She'll use every weapon at her disposal to destroy us all. Sophie thought about Elena hunched over her sewing machine, about the worry lines around her mother's eyes, about 28 years of wondering who her father was and why he'd never tried to find her. She already destroyed us, Sophie said simply. We're just going to return the favor. Daniel pulled out his phone, his expression determined. I'll set up the meeting with grandmother. Tell her I want to bring my new girlfriend to meet her. He looked at Sophie with an expression that was equal parts apology and resolve. Sorry, poor choice of words. We'll need more than just a confession, Jonathan said, his strategic mind already working. We'll need the documentary evidence, the bank records, maybe some of the people she paid off. We'll need to make sure there's no way she can claim the recording was faked or taken out of context. Sophie nodded. How long do we have? The gala is Saturday night. Today is Tuesday. Jonathan looked at both of them seriously. That gives us 4 days to build an airtight case against one of the most powerful women in New York. 4 days to gather evidence that will destroy my mother and reshape our entire family. Can we do it? Sophie asked. Daniel was already scrolling through his contacts. Grandmother's assistant, Margaret, has worked for her for 30 years. If anyone knows where the bodies are buried, it's her." He looked up at them with a grim smile. "And Margaret's always liked me better than she likes grandmother." Jonathan moved to his desk and pulled out a legal pad. "We'll need lawyers, investigators, maybe journalists we can trust to break the story if things go wrong." He paused. "And we'll need to prepare Elena. If we're doing this, if we're bringing everything into the light, she needs to be ready for what's coming." Sophie felt a surge of anticipation mixed with terror. They were about to take on Beatrice Lancaster on her own turf, using her own weapons against her. It was either the beginning of justice or the end of everything they'd managed to build. "One more thing," she said quietly. "When this is over, when the truth is out and the dust settles, what happens to us, to our family?" Jonathan and Daniel looked at each other, then at her. For the first time since learning they were siblings, Daniel's expression softened. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But whatever happens, we face it together. As a real family this time, not one built on lies." The Lancaster Foundation's annual charity gala was Manhattan's social event of the season. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a glittering homage to old New York elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk. Towering floral arrangements filled the air with the scent of white roses and gardenias, and 500 of the city's most influential people mingled in evening wear that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Sophie stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hands trembling as she smoothed the deep blue evening gown Jonathan had insisted on buying her. "You're representing the family tonight," he'd said with grim humor. Might as well look the part. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was wearing a dress that cost more than Elena made in 3 months, preparing to destroy the woman who had stolen her mother's chance at this very life. "You look beautiful," Daniel said quietly, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. His own formal wear was impeccable, but Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his jaw. The past 4 days had aged him years. "Thank you." Sophie accepted the champagne but didn't drink it. She needed to stay sharp tonight. "Any word from Margaret?" Daniel nodded. She confirmed everything. Grandmother's safe in her study contains copies of all the documents from 1995, the fake medical reports, the bank transfers, even correspondence with the people she hired. Margaret's been the one maintaining the files all these years, and she's willing to testify. She's 73 years old and tired of keeping secrets. When I told her what those documents really represented, Daniel's expression darkened. "Let's just say Margaret has her own reasons for wanting to see grandmother's legacy corrected." Across the ballroom, Beatrice Lancaster held court at the head table like a queen presiding over her kingdom. At 78, she was still a formidable presence. Silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, pearls gleaming at her throat, her black evening gown perfectly tailored to disguise the ravages of illness. She moved with the careful grace of someone in pain, but determined not to show weakness. "She looks smaller than I expected," Sophie murmured. "Don't let that fool you," Jonathan said, joining them. His own tension was visible in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes never left his mother's figure. She's been preparing for this night her entire life. In her mind, tonight is her final performance, her last chance to cement the Lancaster legacy, and we're about to turn it into her funeral pyre, Daniel said with satisfaction. They'd spent the past 4 days building their case with military precision. Jonathan's investigators had tracked down 2 of the actors Beatrice had hired in 1995. Both were dead, but one had left a written confession with his lawyer, insurance against potential future prosecution. Margaret had provided copies of the damning documents, along with her own sworn statement about her role in maintaining Beatrice's deception. But the most crucial element of their plan was Elena herself. Sophie turned toward the ballroom entrance and felt her breath catch. Elena Navarro walked through the doors like a woman stepping back in time. She wore a simple black dress that Sophie had never seen before, her graying hair styled in an elegant updo, and for the first time in years, she moved without the hunched shoulders of defeat. "My God," Jonathan breathed beside her. "She's still the most beautiful woman in the room." The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the tired seamstress who fell asleep over her sewing machine. In her place stood the woman Elena had been meant to be, confident, graceful, radiating the kind of quiet dignity that no amount of money could buy. Beatrice noticed Elena immediately. Sophie watched the older woman's face go through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally, cold calculation. Even from across the room, Sophie could see Beatrice's mind working, assessing this new threat to her carefully orchestrated evening. "She's coming over," Daniel warned. Beatrice approached their group with the measured steps of a predator, her smile sharp as a blade. 2 security guards flanked her, ostensibly protection, but Sophie recognized them as intimidation. "Jonathan, darling," Beatrice said, her voice carrying clearly over the ballroom's murmur. "What an unexpected surprise. And you must be Miss Ellis." Her gaze fixed on Sophie with reptilian focus. "Daniel has told me so much about you." "Mrs. Lancaster." Sophie's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Thank you for including me tonight." "Of course, dear. Family is so important." "Don't you think?" Beatrice's smile didn't waver, but her eyes glittered with malice. "And Miss Navarro? What a blast from the past." Elena stepped forward, and Sophie saw 29 years of pain and dignity crystallize into pure steel. "Beatrice, you look well for someone who's been poisoning lives for 3 decades." The temperature around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. Other guests were beginning to notice the tension, conversations quieting as heads turned toward their group. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Beatrice said, but Sophie caught the slight tremor in her voice. "Though I suppose it's natural for someone in your circumstances to harbor resentments." "My circumstances?" Elena's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean the circumstances you created when you convinced me I was diseased? When you made me believe I would kill my own child?" "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced from the stage, "please take your seats. Mrs. Lancaster will be giving her traditional welcome address shortly." Beatrice's smile returned, triumphant. "How exciting. My speech tonight will be particularly memorable, I think. A celebration of family legacy and the lengths we go to protect what matters most." She moved away toward the stage, her security detail trailing behind her. Sophie felt a moment of panic. What if Beatrice didn't take the bait? What if she stuck to safe platitudes instead of revealing her true nature? "Don't worry," Daniel said quietly. "I know my grandmother. She can't resist gloating when she thinks she's won." They took their seats at a table near the front as Beatrice ascended to the podium. The ballroom fell silent, 500 of New York's elite turning their attention to the woman who had shaped their social landscape for decades. "My dear friends," Beatrice began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the Lancaster Foundation's charitable work, but the enduring power of family legacy, the sacrifices we make, the difficult decisions we embrace, all in service of preserving what truly matters." Sophie felt for the recording device hidden in her evening bag. Daniel had a backup recorder, and Jonathan's security team was capturing everything on video from multiple angles. "Some of you may remember my son's wild years," Beatrice continued, her gaze finding Jonathan in the audience. "When he was young and foolish, taken in by the wrong sort of person, a woman who tried to trap him with false claims of pregnancy, who thought she could buy her way into our family with lies and manipulation." Elena's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the microphone. "But family protects family," Beatrice pressed on, warming to her theme. "Sometimes that means making hard choices. Sometimes it means exposing uncomfortable truths. I'm proud to say that I saved my son from a disastrous entanglement with a woman who would have destroyed everything we'd built." "Tell them how," Elena called out, rising from her seat. "Tell them exactly how you saved him." Beatrice's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "Sit down, Miss Navarro. You're embarrassing yourself. Am I? Or am I finally giving you the audience you've always craved for your masterpiece?" Elena's voice carried clearly through the ballroom. "Tell them about the fake medical reports. Tell them about the actors you hired. Tell them how you convinced a pregnant woman that she was diseased and dangerous." The ballroom erupted in whispers. Phones appeared as guests began recording, sensing scandal in the making. "Security!" Beatrice snapped, but her guards hesitated, uncertain whether to act against someone Jonathan was clearly protecting. "Tell them," Sophie said, standing beside her mother, "or I will. Every detail, every payment, Every lie. She held up a thick folder. Because we have proof of everything. Beatrice stared at them for a long moment, her face cycling through rage, fear, and finally, resignation. When she spoke again, her voice carried the venom of a cornered snake. Yes, she hissed into the microphone. I did whatever was necessary to protect my family from a gold-digging whore who thought pregnancy gave her a claim on the Lancaster fortune. I created medical reports showing she had syphilis. I hired people to convince her that her bastard child would be born diseased. I gave her money to disappear, and I made sure she stayed gone. The ballroom fell completely silent. Because that's what real family does. Beatrice continued, her voice rising to a shout. We protect what's ours. We preserve our legacy. We don't let some nobody from Queens destroy 3 generations of Lancaster achievement, even if it means destroying your own son's happiness. Jonathan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Even if it means stealing 28 years of my daughter's life, Beatrice laughed, the sound echoing through the ballroom like breaking glass. Your daughter? Oh, Jonathan, did you really think I didn't know? Did you think I wouldn't recognize her the moment she walked into our lives? The admission hung in the air like a poison cloud. You knew, Sophie whispered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. You knew who I was, and you were going to let Daniel is smart enough to find appropriate companions when the time comes. Beatrice snapped. A little misdirection never hurt anyone. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Beatrice hadn't just known about Sophie's identity. She'd been actively encouraging Daniel's interest, planning to reveal the truth at the worst possible moment. Daniel stepped forward, his face white with fury and disgust. You were going to let me fall in love with my own sister. You were going to destroy both of us just to maintain your sick idea of family purity. I was going to teach you both a lesson about the consequences of defying Lancaster family values. Beatrice shot back. The ballroom had dissolved into chaos. Guests shouting questions. Reporters pushing forward, cameras flashing from every direction. But Sophie heard none of it. She stared at this woman who had orchestrated decades of pain and manipulation, who had stolen her father and nearly destroyed her brother, all in service of a legacy built on lies. You're finished, Sophie said quietly, but the microphones caught every word. Your legacy, your reputation, everything you've built. It's all ash now. Beatrice looked around the ballroom at the faces of people she'd considered friends and allies, now staring at her with horror and revulsion. Her empire was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to the world. Perhaps, she said with the last remnants of her dignity, but I regret nothing. The Lancaster name will survive this. It always has. She collapsed then, the cancer and the stress and the weight of her exposure finally overwhelming her. As paramedics rushed to help her, Sophie felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only the hollow ache of justice that had come 30 years too late. Beatrice Lancaster died 3 days after her public confession. Alone in a private room at Mount Sinai Hospital, the cancer that had been eating away at her for months finally claimed victory, but not before she managed one final act of manipulation that would echo through the family for years to come. Sophie sat in the hospital waiting room, staring at the envelope a nurse had pressed into her hands an hour earlier. Mrs. Lancaster insisted this be given to you personally, the woman had said with obvious reluctance. She was very specific about the timing. Elena sat beside her, their hands intertwined, both of them still processing the events of the past week. The media frenzy following the gala had been relentless. Every major news outlet had picked up the story of Manhattan's Grand Dame confessing to decades of manipulation and fraud. The Lancaster family name, so carefully cultivated for generations, had become synonymous with scandal and cruelty. Are you going to open it? Elena asked quietly. Sophie turned the envelope over in her hands. Her name was written across the front in Beatrice's spidery handwriting, but something about the paper felt different. Older, more fragile than modern stationery. Inside were 2 items, a brief note in Beatrice's hand, and what appeared to be a much older letter, yellowed with age and creased from years of folding and unfolding. Miss Ellis, Beatrice's note read, I suppose you've won, but before you celebrate your victory, you might want to know that some truths are more complicated than they appear. The attached letter was hidden behind your mother's portrait for 29 years. I found it only yesterday, during the restoration work Jonathan ordered. Perhaps it will give you some perspective on the choices people make when they believe they're protecting those they love. B.L. Sophie's hands trembled as she unfolded the older letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Elena's, younger and more careful than her current script, but definitely hers. My dearest Jonathan, it began. By the time you read this, I will be far from New York, and you will know why I had to leave. Dr. Morrison has confirmed what I feared. I am sick, and continuing this pregnancy would put our child at terrible risk. But more than that, it would put you in danger too. Sophie felt the world tilt sideways. Mommy? Elena leaned over to read the letter, her face going pale as she recognized her own words from nearly 3 decades ago. I know you would insist on standing by me if you knew the truth. The letter continued. You would sacrifice your health, your future, your family's reputation, all for love. That's the kind of man you are. Noble and generous and willing to give up everything for the people you care about. But I love you too much to let you destroy yourself for me. I wrote this, Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The night before I left, I was going to leave it for him. But then Mrs. Lancaster offered to deliver it after I was gone. I want you to know that every moment we spent together was the happiest of my life. You taught me to read. You showed me what real love could be. You made me believe I was worthy of something beautiful. I will carry that with me always, even as I carry our child away from the life we dreamed of sharing. Sophie looked up to find Jonathan standing in the doorway, his face haggard from 3 days of dealing with lawyers, reporters, and the complete collapse of his family's public image. Daniel was beside him, looking equally exhausted, but somehow more grounded than he had since learning the truth. The letter, Jonathan said hoarsely. She found it. Sophie nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She handed him the yellowed pages and watched his face crumble as he read his lost love's words. Please don't look for me, Elena's letter concluded. Please don't try to follow where I've gone. Find someone worthy of you, someone who can give you the life you deserve without bringing shame to your family name. Marry her, have children with her, be happy. That's all I want for you. Happiness and a future free from the shadows I would cast over it. All my love, always and forever. Elena. She did love me, Jonathan whispered, even after everything my mother told her, even believing she was diseased. She loved me enough to sacrifice her own happiness for mine, just like you loved her enough to spend 30 years searching, Sophie said softly. The irony was devastating. Elena had written the letter Beatrice claimed never to have received, had poured out her heart and her reasons for leaving, but instead of delivering it, Beatrice had hidden it away, letting both her son and Elena suffer for decades under the weight of misunderstanding. She hid it behind the portrait, Daniel said, his voice numb with disbelief. All these years, the truth was literally staring at us from the wall. Elena was crying now, great silent tears that spoke of 29 years of guilt and self-recrimination finally lifting from her shoulders. I thought if I told him the truth, he would insist on coming with me. I thought I was protecting him by making him believe I didn't care. And I thought you had chosen someone else over me, Jonathan said, settling into the chair across from them. My mother showed me a forged letter, convinced me you'd never loved me at all. Sophie felt anger and heartbreak warring in her chest. Even in death, Beatrice had managed one final manipulation, revealing the letter not as an act of mercy, but as a way to show that Elena had been complicit in her own exile. It was brilliant and cruel, designed to complicate any simple narrative of victim and villain. What happens now? Sophie asked. It was Daniel who answered. Now we figure out how to be a family, a real one this time, built on truth instead of lies. The past 3 days had been a crash course in media management and damage control. The Lancaster Global Holdings board had demanded Jonathan's resignation, then reversed course when the company's stock price actually rose. Following the revelation that he'd been a victim rather than a villain, the charity foundation had been restructured, with Elena appointed as its new director, a move that generated significant positive press and helped rehabilitate the family's image. But the personal costs were still being calculated. I've been thinking about what you said at the gala, Daniel said to Sophie. About giving up the fortune and starting over? Maybe that's not such a bad idea. Daniel, Jonathan began. No, Dad. Hear me out. Daniel's voice was stronger than it had been since learning about Sophie. I've spent my whole life being groomed to inherit grandmother's legacy. But what if that legacy isn't worth inheriting? What if the money and the power and the social position are all built on the same foundation of lies and manipulation? Sophie thought about Elena working 16-hour days to keep food on the table, about the stack of unpaid bills on their kitchen counter. Money isn't evil by itself, she said carefully. It's what people do with it that matters. Exactly, Elena said, speaking for the first time since reading the letter. Your grandmother used wealth as a weapon to control and destroy, but we could use it differently. We could use it to help people instead of hurting them. Jonathan looked around at his family, his lost love, his daughter, his son, and Sophie saw something shift in his expression. The grief and anger that had defined him for 3 decades were still there, but underneath them was something new. Hope. The foundation, he said slowly. We could expand it, focus on helping single mothers, families separated by circumstances beyond their control. We could use the Lancaster name and resources to fix some of the damage people like my mother have caused. And, Sophie prompted, sensing there was more, Jonathan met her eyes directly. And we could make sure that any woman facing the kind of impossible choice your mother faced has access to real medical care, real support, real alternatives. We could make sure no one else has to sacrifice their family because someone else thinks they know what's best. It wasn't enough. Sophie knew that no amount of good work could undo 29 years of separation, couldn't give her back the childhood she'd spent wondering about her father, or Elena, the decades she'd lost to guilt and shame. But it was a beginning. There's something else, Daniel said quietly. I've decided to take some time away, travel, maybe, do some thinking about who I want to be when I'm not defined by being a Lancaster heir. Sophie felt a pang of sympathy for this young man, who'd had his entire identity shattered along with hers. That's probably wise. When I come back, Daniel continued, I'd like to try being your brother, your actual brother, not some confused guy who was falling for you because we were both too screwed up to recognize what we really needed from each other. I'd like that too, Sophie said, and meant it. As they sat there in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the debris of Beatrice's final manipulation, Sophie felt something she'd never experienced before. The complicated, messy, imperfect reality of belonging to a family, not the fantasy she'd constructed as a child, but something real and wounded and determined to heal. It would take time. It would take work. But for the first time in 28 years, Sophie Ellis Lancaster knew exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, the small chapel in Central Park was nothing like the grand cathedral where Beatrice Lancaster had always envisioned her son's wedding would take place. Sunlight streamed through simple stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across wooden pews filled with a carefully chosen gathering of family and friends. No society photographers, no elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. Just the quiet dignity of 2 people who had found their way back to each other after 3 decades of separation. Sophie stood at the front of the chapel as Elena's maid of honor, watching her mother float down the aisle in a simple cream-colored dress that Elena had sewn herself. At 49, Elena Navarro had never looked more beautiful. The worry lines that had etched themselves around her eyes over the years had softened. And for the first time in Sophie's memory, her mother moved without the weight of shame and regret. Bowing her shoulders, Jonathan waited at the altar in a perfectly tailored suit, but Sophie noticed his hands shaking slightly as Elena approached. He looked younger somehow, as if finally learning the truth about Elena's disappearance had lifted years from his shoulders. The grief that had haunted his gray eyes for as long as Sophie had known him had been replaced by something she'd never seen there before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Daniel stood beside his father as best man, having returned from 6 months of traveling through South America, just in time for the ceremony. He looked different too, more grounded, more at peace with himself. The confident playboy charm he'd worn like armor had been replaced by something more genuine, more real. You look happy, he'd told Sophie that morning as they'd helped Elena prepare for the ceremony. Different, like you finally know where you belong. He was right. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of change and discovery. Sophie had officially taken the Lancaster name. Though she'd kept Ellis as her middle name, a bridge between the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. She'd moved into a small apartment in Manhattan, close enough to both Elena and Jonathan to maintain the family connections they were all still learning to navigate. The Lancaster Foundation had been completely restructured under Elena's direction. What had once been a vehicle for Beatrice's social ambitions had become a genuine force for good, focusing on supporting single mothers and reuniting families separated by deception or circumstance. Sophie had discovered a talent for grant writing and program development, channeling her years of financial struggle into designing support systems that actually addressed people's real needs. The work was satisfying in ways she'd never expected. Every family they helped reunite felt like a small victory against the kind of cruelty Beatrice had inflicted. Every single mother who received support instead of judgment felt like justice for Elena's lost years. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, and Sophie forced herself to focus on the ceremony rather than her wandering thoughts. Elena and Jonathan had written their own vows, and as they exchanged promises in front of their small congregation, Sophie felt tears tracking down her cheeks. They spoke of forgiveness and second chances, of love that had survived decades of separation and manipulation, of choosing each other not just once but over and over again through all the years when they thought they were lost to each other forever. "I promise to trust you with the truth, even when it's painful," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel. "I promise to fight for us instead of trying to protect you from me. I promise to believe that our love is worth whatever the world might think or say. I promise to never stop looking for you, even when you're standing right beside me," Jonathan replied. "I promise to trust your choices and your strength. I promise to build a life with you that honors both the time we lost and the time we have left." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was soft and reverent, the kiss of two people who understood how rare and precious true love really was. The reception was held in the garden behind Jonathan's penthouse, transformed for the evening with string lights and simple white flowers. Sophie found herself playing hostess alongside Daniel, greeting the guests who had become their chosen family over the past months. Margaret, Beatrice's former assistant, who had been instrumental in documenting the truth. Dr. Sarah Chen, Elena's new physician, who had confirmed once and for all that Elena had never been ill. Maria Santos, a single mother Elena had helped through the foundation, who had become like a sister to her. "Strange how small a real family gathering can be," Daniel commented as they watched Jonathan and Elena dance to an old jazz standard. "I like it better this way," Sophie said. "More intimate, more honest, more real," Daniel agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I needed to figure out who I was when I wasn't performing the role of perfect Lancaster heir. And, did you figure it out?" Daniel smiled. The first genuinely carefree smile Sophie had seen from him since learning they were siblings. "I'm a teacher. Can you believe it? I spent 6 months working in schools in rural Peru, and I loved every minute of it. I'm going back after the holidays to help set up a new education program." Sophie felt a surge of pride for this man, who had managed to transform his identity crisis into something meaningful. Beatrice would have hated that. Yeah, she would have. Which is part of what makes it perfect. Daniel's expression grew more serious. "Sophie, I need you to know something. What happened between us before we knew, I don't regret it. Exactly. Not the feelings, anyway. You made me want to be a better person. And that was real, even if the romantic part was impossible." "I know," Sophie said quietly, "and you helped me understand what family could feel like, even before we knew we actually were family." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their parents dance under the string lights. It struck Sophie how ordinary this moment was, and how extraordinary ordinariness felt when you'd spent your whole life longing for it. "Miss Lancaster." Sophie turned to find a young woman hovering uncertainly at the edge of the garden. She looked to be about 22, heavily pregnant, and obviously nervous about interrupting a private celebration. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman continued. "I'm Jessica Martinez. I called the foundation last week about my situation." Sophie remembered the case. A young woman whose boyfriend had abandoned her when she refused to have an abortion, whose family had disowned her for getting pregnant outside marriage. The foundation had been working to find her stable housing and prenatal care. "Of course, Jessica. Is everything all right?" Did you need something tonight? Jessica shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. No, nothing's wrong. I wanted to thank you, in person, for everything you've done, for believing my story when everyone else said I was lying about the father. Sophie felt her heart contract. You don't need to thank us for treating you with basic human dignity. But I do, Jessica insisted. Because you showed me that sometimes the truth does matter. That sometimes people do the right thing, even when it's complicated. She looked toward Jonathan and Elena, still swaying together on the makeshift dance floor. Is it true what they said in the papers? About your parents finding each other after 30 years? It's true, Sophie confirmed. Jessica smiled through her tears. Then maybe there's hope for all of us. Maybe the truth really does set people free, even when it takes a while to come out. As Jessica melted back into the evening crowd, Sophie felt the weight of responsibility and possibility settle on her shoulders. The foundation wasn't just about providing practical support. It was about proving that Beatrice's vision of the world, where power and status mattered more than truth and compassion, didn't have to be the only option. What are you thinking about? Daniel asked. Sophie gestured to the scene around them. Elena and Jonathan slow dancing, their faces radiant with happiness. Margaret chatting animatedly with Dr. Chen about the foundation's expansion plans. Maria's children playing quietly in the corner, while their mother finally had a chance to relax and enjoy herself. I'm thinking about legacy, Sophie said. About what we choose to pass on to the next generation. And what have we chosen? Sophie thought about Jessica's question. About hope and truth and the long, complicated journey toward healing. She thought about Elena's quiet strength and Jonathan's patient love. About Daniel's courage in rebuilding his identity and her own discovery of purpose in helping others. We've chosen to prove that love is stronger than lies, she said finally. That families can be rebuilt on truth instead of manipulation. That sometimes the best way to honor the past is to make sure it never happens again. Daniel nodded slowly. I can live with that legacy. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Sophie found herself alone with Elena and Jonathan in the garden, her parents, because that's what they were now, officially and irrevocably, sat together on a bench, Elena's head on Jonathan's shoulder, both of them looking tired but utterly content. Any regrets? Sophie asked, settling on the grass beside them. About what? Elena asked. Any of it. The years apart, the lies, the public revelation. Do you ever wish things had happened differently? Elena and Jonathan exchanged a look. The kind of wordless communication that only came from deep understanding and shared experience. I regret the time we lost, Elena said slowly. I regret that you grew up without knowing your father, that Daniel grew up with a grandmother who valued control more than love. I regret that it took so long for the truth to come out. But, Jonathan added, I don't regret the journey that brought us here. You are the woman you are because of the struggles you faced. Daniel found his own strength because he had to question everything he'd been taught. The foundation exists because we understand what it feels like to be powerless against someone else's lies. Our pain became our purpose, Elena said simply. That's not nothing. Sophie lay back on the grass, looking up at the stars barely visible through Manhattan's light pollution. Somewhere out there, other families were struggling with their own versions of the Lancaster legacy. Secrets and lies, manipulation and control, love corrupted by power and fear. But somewhere else, families were finding their way back to each other. Single mothers were getting support instead of judgment. Children were being reunited with parents they'd lost to circumstances beyond their control. Sometimes the truth does take a while to surface, Sophie said, echoing Jessica's words. But when it does, it changes everything. Above them, the string lights twinkled like earthbound stars, illuminating the faces of 3 people who had found their way home to each other through 30 years of darkness. It wasn't the ending any of them had planned, but it was theirs, real and complicated, and built on a foundation that could never be shaken by lies. It was enough. It was everything.